Hello everybody. I'm going to do a quick tutorial trying to show some basic principles of UVs in Maya. Setting up UVs can be a very arduous task. It can be confusing to some. At first it can be very frustrating, but I hope this tutorial will help you to get over that fear and that there is nothing to worry about. But there's some common mistakes that people make, I think, using Maya early on. Bad habits get developed, and I hope that this tutorial will help you to overcome those. So I'm just going to start with a very simple shape. I'm just going to put a cube out into the world, and I'm going to scale it real big. And I'm going to start to do some very basic modeling. I'm just going to grab this top face and I'm just going to stretch it out like so. Now, one thing I want to point out before I go too far into this, if I take a look at the UV editor, and a lot of people go up here and click that button and a big window pops out on top. When we're working with UVs, we can jump into this workspace here, which is really nice. Gives us a much better view of all of the different tools that we have at our disposal. And when we start with a cube, the first thing that we can see here is the cube unwrapped. And each one of these boxes here represents a face that is on our object. Now, as we're modeling, say we grab a face, we simply want to move it. We'll notice that the texture here stretches because the UVs are not being updated automatically. There is a feature within the Move tool to update UVs while you're modeling, but it doesn't work the way I would expect. So we just have to kind of live with the fact that this is not going to auto-magically update our UVs for us. And I like having this view while I'm explaining this, because I can see here clearly that my UVs are just not being updated and my textures are being stretched. Now, a little bit of setup here in the UV editor just to point out, I've got a couple of things turned on. Very important. I've got my texture borders turned on, and that is showing me where there are cuts on my geometry, the edges that have been cut away. And when I turn that on and off, you can see in the left viewport, these white lines pop up. And that's very important to give us a visual indicator as to where there are cuts in our texture. I also have this turned on here, the checkerboard pattern. You can load in a texture if you want, or if you already have a texture applied to your shape, then you can load that in and display the image. But I'm just going to have the checkerboard on for this demonstration. And for just, basics, I'm just going to point out that as I grab this set of boxes, I could select all by making a box, or Command-Shift-A. As I move this around, the relationship of each one of these polygons to the texture below it relates directly to what is being projected on each one of these polygons. Okay, so back to what I was saying earlier. As I was modeling along, moving my faces around, the texture itself is getting stretched, but nothing is getting updated over here. Now, Maya is very much a node-based system. So if I look carefully at my attribute editor, and I just jump back into the Maya Classic workspace, I can see that as I'm doing things to my object, I'm getting new nodes popping up here. And things are changing within them as I start to tweak certain settings and stuff like that. If I, for example, grab the object and I translate it, I move it somewhere else, then these attributes in here are going to change. So I started with a very small cube, and now I've scaled it up real big. I've done a little bit of poly tweaking, which was moving this face up here, up and down. And I can see the whole stack of these when I'm in object mode. I can see all of the different nodes that are getting added, and this is also referred to as our history. So when we're finished modeling, and I'll just hop back into UV editing, we want to get rid of all of that information. We want to make sure that our transformations are frozen, and we want to make sure that our history is gone, that we delete our history. So if I jump back to the Maya Classic view, and you can see I get really comfortable jumping between the two, I can grab my object, and I can see in object mode, when I highlight my object, I've got all of these tabs along the top. I've got all these nodes. If I press this button here, delete by type, then this will get a lot simpler. It's actually saving a little bit of memory, and the system can get very bogged down if we have a lot of these up here. And as we're modeling along, we can get a lot of these nodes included into our file. And from time to time, when you're satisfied with what you're doing, when you think you've got something in a good position, you could save a version of the file to make sure that you've still got your history, save another version of it, and then just click on this button here to delete by type history. We need to do this before we start working with our UVs. The other thing too that's incredibly important is looking at the transformations. Now I haven't moved this or rotated it, and I often like to work with my object centered off in the screen in the viewport, because I can use symmetry. And when I've got symmetry, for example, I can very easily grab things across the object. So I've got object X turned on right now. So you can see as I change into edge mode here, I can quickly grab both sides, which is really nice. Or I can switch over to object Z, and then I can grab objects on the other side. So I try to leave things in the center of my screen so that symmetry works. But often when we're modeling, we can use just simple scalar tools, for example, to stretch down our object. Say we're working on a table leg and we start to scale our object to make something that we like. You'll notice here that the scale gets to be these interesting numbers. So we've scaled at a certain height, and we've got a width on the X and Y order that are these sort of odd numbers. Because we're just doing it visually and we're not typing in values, and we're not really paying attention to this too closely, so we're not really thinking too much. But when we switch over to the UV editing workspace, the UVs don't really care as to what we're doing in terms of scale. The UVs, as they relate to each one of the faces, are just staying exactly the same. So if I wanted to try to unwrap this object right now, which is the act of unfolding all of the faces based on where the cuts are being made, if I grabbed all of my faces and in my UV toolkit, and a lot of you are going to see it like this for the first time, everything's collapsed like this, we're going to notice that they've stacked things in a certain order, which is really awesome. Create, cut, unfold. We tend to do these things in this order. But because we started with a cube, it already had its cuts made. But if I hit cut and sew right now, if I hit the cut button, nothing changes. I would expect each one of these faces to be the right size. The problem is we haven't baked the transformations into the modeled shape. So if I switch back to my classic view here, I go back to my object mode and look carefully at my scales. Well, interesting. It doesn't know that the new face is meant to be a certain height and width because it's only working off of the scales of the stretched object, of the stretched cube. So to overcome that, just select your object in object mode and click on this button up here, the little snowflake, and that's just to freeze all the transformations. Very important that we do that. And it now tells Maya that this is what my object is at its base value, at its base size, rotation, and position. This is where it belongs in space, in its natural rotation, and this is its original scale. This is its size. So by clicking this snowflake, we're freezed our transforms. We go over here to this button here. When we're finished modeling happily, we see all of these tabs along the top, and we delete by type history, and then that gets nice and truncated down into the right size, into the right number of nodes that we want to move on, because we're satisfied with what we've just created. Now, another important step at this point in time, because the default shader has been assigned to the object, it's a Lambert 1, we do need to give this a unique shader name. So it doesn't matter if you want to go into assign new material and do something in Arnold. I'm just going to do something simple here, a favorite material, Blinn. And now I can type into this box and give this a name. So this might be my table leg, for example. And that's going to be important later on, because when I export it into Substance Painter, it's going to have a nice name. When I bring the FBX file over into a video game engine like Unreal, it's going to have a nice name, and that's important. And we might want to just actually concatenate that with material, add that word on as well, so it's different than the object itself. So we model, we can scale, we can stretch, we can reposition, and then when we're satisfied in object mode, we just take a look at its scales, we freeze its transforms, delete the history because we're happy with where we are with our modeling. Then when we pop over into UV editing mode and we look at all the faces and we select all, because the system now knows the height and width of each one of these polygonal faces, when I unfold this object now, whoa, it's just thrown all kinds of different faces out because each one of these has been cut away. Now these are each referred to as UV shells, and if you right click in here, you can see that you have an option to select them independently, and they can be moved around. You can see that the texture is moving on each one of the polygons because they relate one to one. And somewhere along this process, I had selected all of the edges and accidentally clicked the button Cut. Now this is a good mistake that I've just made, because how do I fix this now? Well, no matter how complex your geometry is, what we need to do is reset our UVs. So even if we were just working with the base cube, like so, it might appear to have all of the nice cuts that we want. We can go over into our UV editing and on this object, we can start with the creation of new UVs. I can use planar, or I can use camera-based. A lot of pros use planar, because what this will do is just project an image directly onto the front face, stretch down the sides, and then project the plane on the back as well. But what we have here are a set of intact UVs, meaning there are no cuts. We're starting from scratch. I like to use camera-based because it shows me my edges, which is pretty neat. And then with this turned on, this button here where I can show my texture edges, my texture borders, I can start to see where I want to make my cuts. And I have to think, okay, well, where am I going to cut this in order to unfold it? So this is where we got to get into edge mode here. So we get into edge mode and we start to make our cuts. So if we were thinking about this as a paper cube in the real world and we had an X-Acto knife, where would we cut and then unfold along edges to get this box unwrapped? So I might think I need to cut the top off. So I'm going to select those 3 edges. I'm going to open my cut tools and press cut. And with this turned on here, very important, I get to see this nice white edge along my object. So now this, like the lid of a box, can unfold flat. The front needs a cut, and I can keep jumping over here and just adding them one to one, or I can hold down Shift and select multiple edges and hit cut. And I think because the top will fold back like a lid, the front will fold down onto the ground and they'll match evenly with the bottom plane, and then this back edge here will act like a hinge to flatten it out. Now in theory, if I select all of the faces for this object and I simply press unfold, then we should see this turn into a nice set of UVs. Now, of course, this is a simple cube and we're all the way back to where we were when we started working with that cube. But I'm just going to move on to this shape here. So I'm going to grab this object, and I've made a mistake. I accidentally selected all of the edges, I selected all of the faces, and I hit cut, and it cut all of the edges away. But that's fine, because I can reset my UVs now. I can grab this object, create planar, or I like to use camera-based, doesn't really matter. And then similarly to this cube problem, I need to think about where I'm going to make my cuts. So I want to make the top fold back and add a cut there. And then my sides are going to come down. Add my cuts there. And because I have frozen my transforms and deleted my history, when I grab all of my faces and hit unfold, et voila. Now, for some strange reason, Maya tends to rotate the UVs for some strange reason, but you can grab the same tools that you're used to in modeling, like move, scale, and rotate, and you can rotate them into position. Or you can use these tools down here, align and snap, to do some work for you. Or arrange and layout. Arrange and layout's got some really nice stuff in it. Like if you press the layout button, it'll shrink down your UVs to fit in. Now underneath the unfold tools, I just want to step back here for a second. So we create using camera-based. When we've got our complete reset UVs, we make our cuts. Then we unfold, and then once if it's rotated, though we can't necessarily rotate it perfectly where we want it to be, we can ask it to straighten. And I've got it set to 30 degrees is the angle that it's going to straighten it out at. And it's done a pretty good job. And then under Arrange and Layout, I can just press the Layout button for this shell. Press the Layout button, and it'll put it inside of the tile, inside of the UDIM. Now this shape here, now maybe I want these two shapes to go out into Unreal as one combined object. So let me see here. I'm just going to go back to object mode. I can grab both of these objects and I can combine them using this tool here. So if this was a bunch of table legs and one was a tabletop, then I can combine them all together. And I do want to look at what's happening over here in my outliner. So I can just shift and click on both these objects. I can combine them together. It will generate a third object here, leaving the originals so they can be edited. Now I would like to make sure that this is set up right to go out into a game engine. So I'm just going to go back to the Maya Classic view for a second and look at how I've got all of these new nodes. And it's got all my poly map cuts and it's got all my poly unites. So I'm just going to highlight this, look at my outliner, and once more, get rid of that history, delete history by type. We now have a single cube, which I could call my, if this was my table. I now have a single object. I'm looking carefully at the scale. Nothing's changed because I haven't used any of my transforms to move it around or rotate it or scale it. But from time to time, I just like to click the snowflake just to make sure that I haven't changed anything here. Something's changed up here. It's now made my material back to Lambert 1. So I made the combine afterwards. It's taken on one of the two shaders. So I have to go back in and assign my favorite material. And I'm just going to give this my name, table material. Now, really this is a UV exercise, but I want to hop back in here and just see what's going on. So it hasn't destroyed my UVs, but now I can see the common error when I've got complex shapes, multiple objects in the same scene, or objects that might be overlapping each other, where these UVs are now overlapping, and I can see that this has got much more information on it. The tiles are textured, or the textures are tiled a lot more on top of this shape because this one shell is much larger than this one. It's not packed in properly. So because I created them both separately, and I can highlight each one of the shells, I can quickly rotate them and they're independent, or I can use the straighten UVs, which works awesome. Doesn't always work. You might have to adjust this value in here. That's the angle at which it's got to be tolerant, and make sure that it rotates based on this angle here. But now these two are not scaled appropriately, and this is where the layout button is your friend, because it will compare the two shapes and make sure that these two don't stack on top of each other. So if I press layout, voila. It has done the best job it possibly can fitting both of these UV maps inside of this one tile, inside of this UDIM, to make sure that it is there to fit. Awesome. And they're scaled appropriately in relation to one another, so all of these little checker boxes match perfectly. Now the problem I was confronted with by one of my students was this object here. Now this becomes a little bit more complex because this was not created from several objects. This was created by starting with a cube and then starting to extrude down the legs. And then, as per my request, there needs to be bevels because nothing in the real world has got a 90-degree angle on it, and light doesn't catch perfectly off of these edges. So this is really intended to take the edge off, no pun intended, when we're beveling these edges. But it becomes a little bit more of a complex problem when we're starting to do the UV unwrapping, because this is one shape all combined. So where do we begin? Now when we look at the UVs for this object, I'm going to hop back over into the UV editing mode, we can see that everything's stretched out. Interesting, because this person had started with the cube and started to do their modeling. Well, like I said at the beginning of this video, it doesn't update the UVs auto-magically. It just continues to leave the UVs where they are, and as you're adding geometry, it just starts to cut away at the UVs, adding the appropriate vertices where they belong, edges, etc. So how do we proceed with this? Well, first things first, I look at the object. I got to be in object mode to do this. They've given this object a nice name. I can see that the translation, it's been moved and it's been scaled. So there's that scalar problem again. So if I was just to reset this, I'm just going to put this back to 0, 0, 0. Leave the rotation, but I can't change the scale because this is exactly how big the student wants this table to be, and they had originally stretched out using the cube. They used the scale tool to start modeling, which is awesome. I'm going to take a moment here just to freeze the transformations. And you'll see this cleans this up nicely, 0, 0, 0s. Scale 1, 1, 1, and I can see when I open up my attribute editor that there's a lot going on along the top here in my history. All of these nodes that Maya has created while I've been doing my job. So back to this button here, when we're satisfied with our geometry, we've added the bevels, we like what we see, we're really, really happy with it. We might at this point just save this as a version, just so we still have that history if we want to use it. But I'm going to bake the history into this object by deleting by type the history, clicking the little clock button. And while I'm at it, I'm going to assign my favorite material. That will give me an opportunity, I just gave it a blend, just to give it a name. So I'm going to call this my table material. Once again, this is going to help us when we go into other programs. Jump into something like Substance Painter, it's going to have a nice name instead of just blend 1, blend 2, blend 3. And now I can start doing the unwrap. Now, similar to the other demonstration, I had 2 boxes. Now, in this case, we've got, if we think about it, we've got 5 boxes. Now, whether those were extruded into the geometry or extruded out from the geometry, it really doesn't matter, because if the boxes themselves have to be unwrapped individually. Puzzle, because, and the reason why I say this is a puzzle is that we got all these bevels now, and the bevels can be difficult to work with. So we've got a lot more we've got a lot more edges to worry about, which means this is going to be a little bit more time consuming. But before I get into that, I do want to point out that since we have clicked these 2 buttons up here, we've frozen the transformations and we've deleted the history. If I was just to simply select all right now, and I'm going to go to face mode and select all, and just see how the system is going to unfold this. we'll already begin to see that since we've baked in the transformation, it's starting to better understand how big our polygons are. But we got these weird problematic areas here, which I think they're kind of funny because we have to cut away. This is actually one of the feet or one of the legs. So we actually have to cut it away and make it its own unique UV shell that it itself can be unwrapped individually. So I'm going to try to move through this as quickly as I can. When you're dealing with a lot more geometry like this, where we've got bevels, one thing I'd like to do, I'll just tap the F key to focus in on that one edge, is just to carefully look at where the system will end an edge loop if I double click. So it's based on angle and tolerance. So it sees that there's a sharp angle here. So if I double click on this edge, we'll notice that it will terminate right here. And similarly, it will terminate down at the bottom of this leg. So that's important information to remember for this puzzle, because if I go back to where I was, double click, this is an indicator as to where I can start cutting my legs away, because each one of these legs is a box and each box needs to be unwrapped. So that gives me an indicator that I need to get these legs out as their own shell. So if I double click here, look carefully to see what's being selected, I can ring all the way around. I'm going to tap F just to ring all the way around. I have to be absolutely clear that I've got everything selected, looking at that orange line, because this is where I'm going to cut my UVs. And like you can see from my viewport, this is tricky navigation, and this is really good practice. So I've ringed all the way around this box, which is a leg. I can see it happening in my viewport down here. So I can now press in my UV toolkit, cut and sew. Oh, but wait a second. I should have reset my UVs first. Always, always, always reset your UVs. In object mode, first things first, create, and I'll use camera based. Okay. Now we can get in there and start doing the work. So I'm going to once again just be absolutely clear that what I've got going on here is going to terminate up here at this edge, and now I can start double clicking, making the selection all the way around. With my UVs reset, now when I press cut, it's awesome. I've got its own unique shell for that one leg. And I'm just going to move it over here for now. And I'll probably speed up the video at this point because I don't think we need to watch me do this in slow-mo. So I'm just doing the same process again. looping around, make my cut here. Grab that shell. Oopsies. Make sure I click the cut button. I see the thick white line. Now I can grab that shell, move it off. You can also make selections down here in this viewport. So I just grabbed one of the edges inside of the UV editor, tapped the F key just to focus, zoom to selected, and I can do the same over here. F key, that helps me to orbit around the object. Tapping the F key focuses the view on what you have selected. So I've got that ringed all the way around. I can hit cut, UV shell. This one, I can move it away. I don't have to be moving these away. I just like to show that these are now each their own unique UVs. And maybe just for ease of zooming, I'll highlight an edge in here so that I can tap F and get over to that part of the model really fast. Double click on that edge loop, and I'm just repeating the process. F helps me to orbit easier around the object. And now I'm going all the way around there. One edge loop, cut, and then I can move it. As long as I pick shells, I can move it out of the way. Cool. Cool, cool, cool. So I've got this big old box on the top, and I've got 5 other boxes, or 4 other boxes down below. Each one of them now needs to be solved for. So not too unlike the beginning of this tutorial, I now have to think about how I want to unwrap and unfold each one of these. So this one here, I need to make cuts down the side, because I'm going to want the front face that I'm looking at here to fold down flat. And the nice thing too is as you're going along, you can keep clicking the unwrap button, the unfold button, just to see what's going on. Yeah, so I need to make a cut here. And these thick white lines are telling me that the cuts were already made. So even though there's bevels on this, this is the same thinking as what's going on with those boxes at the beginning. Except these aren't 6-sided boxes. It was extruded down from the original shape, the tabletop. So there's going to be fewer sides. So in theory, this shell now, if I just isolate it alone, all by itself with its cuts, if I hit unfold, it should give us something pretty good. That's pretty good. That's good for now. We can start to optimize it and pack it later on. I'm going to move on to the next one. And once you start to get into a rhythm, things will go fast. Cut there, cut here, cut here, and cut here. Did I make the cut? Yeah, the UV shell, unfold it. Cool. This one here, back to the edge. Now, I'm not being too careful with my cuts, but I have to remember that the seam is going to be visible. And with new modern painting technology, it's not that big of a deal because you can paint over seams. But if we're just going to lay on an image texture, then we do want to be mindful. Yeah, we do want to be mindful of where we're putting our cuts. So I'm putting them on the inside of this table leg, less likely that the camera or the viewer, the player, is going to see it. So unfold. This one, selecting the shell here and then tapping F in this viewport is going to put me over there. Go back to edge. Think about where I'm going to make my cuts. Cut. Cut. How do we unwrap a box? If I had myself an X-Acto knife and I had to cut away seams, how would I do that? Cool. So this UV shell, unfold it. And this is a mess over here right now, but that's fine. We're not going to worry about that. And this is the same issue up here with our tabletop. We just got to think about how we want to unfold this big old box up here. So I need to make cuts down the side, like so. And I just want to point out again, with this control turned on here, we can see the edges of where we made our last cut. Very important. Otherwise we'd go a little bit bonkers trying to remember where we made cuts. Make a cut along there. And I also like to think, you know, this edge up here is eventually going to be its fold. So it's going to be folded down over this edge. So I need a cut along the front, double click, make sure that it matches up with my other cut. Perfect. And move over to the other edge, the other side of my table. Shift double click, make a cut. Make a cut down here. So then in theory, the bottom will fold all the way along this edge. This side will fold along this edge and it'll be completely flattened out. This side, this face here, will fold up along this edge, and similarly this face will fold up along this edge here. So it's a puzzle. In theory, now I can just grab this UV shell, now that I've got the cuts in the right places, unfold it, I can see I've got some issues. But like I said earlier, we don't have to worry too much about mistakes that we've made, because we can either sew stuff together again if we needed to, or we can make further cuts. So I can literally get in here and say like, whoops, I probably should have made a cut along that edge there. I can see where it's stretched. So I'm going to grab this edge. I'm going to double click. So I can do cutting right inside the UV editor. Press the cut button. I'm just curious, where was that on this object? It's over here. Oh, right, because that needs to unfold too along those two seams. Fun. And here, double click, cut. Whoops, that did an entire edge loop across the object, which now has divided these two into separate shells. So I can undo that. Command Z, Control Z. Because of the tolerance here, so I don't want it to go all the way across the object. So I'm just going to carefully press the Shift key and grab those three edges, because I want it to be exactly like the other side. Press cut. Now grab this UV shell and unfold it. That's funny. I think I picked the wrong spot to do the cuts here. Well, we can fix that up again. Get rid of that cut with some undos. Make the cut in the right spot. That's why it did the edge loop. You can see the termination here. There we go. That's what we wanted to see. Make the cut. We don't have to grab the shells. We could grab the faces if you wanted to just select all the faces. But I like, thinking about these as independent shells is important to know. Hit cut. Whoops. When I had them all selected and I pressed cut, it just cut all of them. So it's now they're independent shells. Undo. Make sure my cut's still there. Unfold was what I wanted to press. Now it might look a little bit wonky, so I can press optimize, optimize, optimize. You can keep pressing optimize over and over again, and then straighten the UVs. Now this is a problem I've seen happen where we're at like 100% down here and the brains of the system are going a little bit crazy. And I pressed optimized a bunch of times and it did not optimize them the way I wanted them to. Yeah, I shouldn't have just been clicking optimize all those many times, because it's a pretty labor intensive process for the computer. Anyway, so each one of these legs now I want to optimize them. And I'm going to straighten the UVs. I'm going to grab this one, optimize, optimize, straighten the UVs, straighten the UVs, optimize. It'll often rotate it when you click optimize, so you can straighten the UVs again, straighten the UVs. And one thing we can just do is grab them all. And this is awesome. Arrange and layout. This button here, it's like magic. When we press layout, it'll start to look at each one of these faces and relate them to how big they are in relation to one another. So this one I want to straighten out. For some reason it's not wanting to straighten like the others. When I click straighten UVs, it does a weird, wild job. I don't like what it's doing. And so I'm just going to do it visually myself. looks pretty good. Yeah, looking pretty good. So when I just click this button down here to layout, so if I select all and press layout, it packs everything onto my tile at the right size, which is amazing. Yeah. So this is ready to rumble. This is ready to rock. Production ready. Yes, even with the bevels on. Okay, so that was a longer tutorial than expected, but there's a lot in there, and I hope that was helpful. I mean, one thing I might do just to make my life easier when getting this out into a game engine is just place it on the floor. I did center it off by resetting its position earlier on. Go to object mode, that would be helpful. And then just place it on the ground. So it'll come into my game better. And now it's ready to go on into Unreal or Substance Painter. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that was helpful. Lots in there. Enjoy.